Whoa, 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 hold up. Postmodern neo-Marxism? Okay, this person has heard some dog whistles. Oh, here's the question that's gonna get them riled up. I'm gonna spell this out real simple. Non-binary should absolutely be included under the trans umbrella. There are lots of different identities and experiences that are under the trans umbrella. You can talk about the experience of transsexuals who undergo, medical transition, who deal with sex dysphoria. You can talk about the experience of transgender people who experience social dysphoria with respect to how they're perceived and treated, and who seek to socially transition. It is often the case that somebody is both transgender and transsexual, and they seek out both medical and social transition, but sometimes they may seek out just one or the other. And really, it should depend on what is right for them and them alone, between them, their doctors, and how they want to present themselves. And there are so many overlapping experiences between all the different forms that someone could be transgender and or transsexual and non-binary, and plenty of non-binary people do medically transition. So yeah, these are all overlapping identities that have lots of shared experiences. I mean, if you want to talk about like, a binary transsexual and a non-binary person, like the experience of being perceived and treated as a gender that it feels not right for you by society at large, that's going to be a very common experience between both of those. And there are some ways that non-binary people are taken even less seriously than binary trans people, like by Blaire and the other conservative crowd, who they maybe get like binary trans people, but they, will call non-binary people crazy. Non-binary people are way less likely to even come out to their families because they don't think their families are going to get it or understand or, actually try to treat them with respect and dignity. So there are some ways that non-binary people are affected even worse. And it's often more in kind of like the implicit societal mistreatment or lack of respect from family. But yeah, that's why this entire trans umbrella, because there's no one singular trans experience and so many common, related, overlapping experiences that we can build bridges of allyship and coalition building to collectively advocate for our rights over.
This is evil.
I think that the concept of a transgender umbrella is inherently an issue, right? Because when you're talking about something as nuanced, complex, full of social dynamics, medical dynamics, so many things to be considered.
That's what umbrella means, is that there's a lot of dynamics and they're not going to be universal. Wait, is Blaire saying it's an umbrella is such a problem and then going on to explain why it's an umbrella? Are you freaking kidding me?
And this entire concept actually of transgender is relatively new. Like it came about in the 70s or 80s through queer theory when originally it was about transsexuals, which was considered a medical diagnosis, which was a medical process.
You're also gonna have a hard time coming up with like a very specific definition of transsexual, even under kind of like medical criteria. Like if you look at the medical criteria for gender dysphoria, like under a current diagnosis, there are like lots of different traits which could get marked as gender dysphoria, and you have to meet like a certain number of them. So once again, showing an umbrella of trans experience, like this is how all medical conditions are, and that's not even to mention all the different social experiences.
Binary, which, if I'm to understand correctly, means
I think
that
androgynous.
right, and it means you identify somewhere in between male and female. That's not what a transsexual is.
Right, and that's what the trans umbrella encapsulates, is that there are differences between, say, like someone who is transsexual and transgender, or somebody who is transgender but not transsexual. Yeah, there are differences in their lived experience, but there's also a lot of similarities. And the intersection of those similarities is why they're all under the trans umbrella. That's why it's an umbrella.
I think it makes about as much sense as saying that bisexual is under the straight umbrella.
Okay, this might be a hot take, but you can absolutely work with a framework of bisexual people being under the straight umbrella. Like, if you want to talk about bisexual people who are able to go through the world in a straight passing relationship, in a straight passing manner, versus bisexual people who are not able to do that, like you can really paint an umbrella of experience between bisexual people being under the gay umbrella, bisexual people being under the straight umbrella, and being to varying extents on one side or the other. Like, a bisexual person who is in a straight relationship moving through the world like that is going to have lived experience much more in line with straight people than gay people, while also carrying some of their own stigma with being bisexual, some of the own invisibility of being bisexual. And so, yeah, there's similarities under the straight umbrella and under like the gay umbrella. You can absolutely conceptualize of bisexual people this way. You can do the same thing with like non-binary people or like transgender and transsexual people. I don't think it's mutually exclusive to say that like something has to be a part of like the straight umbrella or like the queer umbrella. Like we can talk about them as potentially overlapping experiences. I mean, especially as like, you know, trans people can be in like straight relationships and have experiences under the straight umbrella while also being under the queer umbrella. I do think it's important to recognize like the intersection of those relationships. Like you're saying how, you know, bi people are going to face like anti-queer legislation. You know, things like bi-erasure or biphobia will still affect bi people even in like straight passing relationships. But, you know, when you conceptualize this under kind of like these intersecting multiple frameworks, you can absolutely understand some bi experience as very similar to some straight experience.
So they typically don't medically transition.
Right.
And when you do so, that at that point, it's a costume.
I mean, there's plenty of non-binary people that can't take off their non-binariness either. So much of, you know, non-binary identity goes beyond just expression. Like, identity is more than just expression. You can't just stop identifying as something because you don't, like, want to. Identity doesn't really work that way. It's something a lot more internal and that can't be like forced out of someone. Like this is why like conversion therapy doesn't work, because you can't just force somebody out of like a sexual identity or like a gender identity. And also, yeah, not even bringing up that plenty of non-binary people do medically transition, so they're not going to be able to take that off either.
As Blaire was saying, it comes out of queer theory, which is postmodern neo-Marxism, which...
Whoa, hold up. Postmodern neo-Marxism? Okay, this person has heard some neo-Nazi dog whistles. So for those that don't know, postmodernism and neo-Marxism are two different philosophies, and they actually contradict each other in numerous ways. The phrase postmodern neo-Marxism was a dog whistle created by neo-Nazis to basically call anything they don't like as like communist and gay and high academia. Like it's basically just to say like, I want to discredit this as being some kind of like gay communist academia theory that is, you know, fringe, when in reality it's oxymoronic and just doesn't make sense. So like, just to kind of break down the distinction, like postmodernism is the philosophy that there's no like universal narrative of truth, that we have to understand things under lots of different frameworks. Like, for example, we can think about, you know, the experience of like a transsexual person. We can think about the experience of a transgender person who's not transsexual. We can think about how these are similar, how these are different, how it's going to vary from person to person, how this is going to intersect with so many other identities and frameworks and narratives and philosophies. Meanwhile, Marxism proposes a more universal narrative of class conflict. So postmodernism and Marxism are just different philosophies. One supports a universal narrative of class conflict, the other doesn't.
It means that there's no such thing as absolute truth. They don't believe there's truth, so it kind of erodes the...
Oh my goodness. Okay, even if you're a postmodernist, you can believe that things are true. Like, postmodernism doesn't mean that, like, there's not a law of gravity which explains how, like, gravitational fields exist. But what a postmodernist would do is say that somebody's experience on Earth with gravity will be like the experience of gravity means that things fall down towards the Earth. Meanwhile, somebody floating out in space is going to have a very different experience of gravity, as in being like pulled in towards a near object. So under the postmodern framework, you can recognize that there is like this universal law of gravity that we have like equations for that explain it, while also recognizing that the subjective experience of gravity is not going to follow a universal narrative because people have different experiences. Say if they lived on like different planets, or on like the ISS, for example, in like 0G, like there's not one single universal experience with respect to gravity.
And it's actually really regressive in a lot of ways.
She's literally just repeating like the neo-Nazi dog whistle of postmodern neo-Marxism, and then poorly explaining what postmodernism is, and not even talking about Marxism at all, because once again, those are contradictory philosophies.
It's literally based off of stereotypes, which we've tried to for so long get rid of. Like, it's okay to be gender nonconforming male or gender nonconforming female.
Yes, and postmodernism would account for that by saying that's one narrative, that's one experience that plenty of people have. Whereas, being transgender might be a different experience. Actually, a really good example of kind of like the gender nonconformity with like a postmodern framework is that for some people, say like a butch lesbian versus like a non-binary transmasculine person, they could perhaps be like very, very, very similar, perhaps even like identical in their expression, in how they live their life, how they're perceived and treated by most people, yet they have that different experience, they have that different identity, they have that different narrative for how they understand their own gender, for how they understand their own identity, and that's fine because that's their own experience. Or yeah, like he, him lesbians are also really another example of how like your own internal experience of gender can be very different than the internal experience of gender of somebody else, and these can coexist even if we have different ideas of gender. Like some people wouldn't never think in their worldview of gender that a he, him lesbian could be a thing, yet they exist and they define themselves that way, and they live their best life regardless. There's not a universal narrative of gender that can encapsulate both of these contradictory worldviews. Yeah, good point from the chat, actually. This has been shown in the research, but the best inoculation factor against bigotry is meeting somebody of that group, connecting with them, becoming friends with them, having that experience. Like, the biggest factor that's going to determine whether or not someone is transphobic, the biggest predicting factor, is whether or not they've actually like interacted with a trans person, they have a trans friend, that kind of thing, tends to be the biggest factor in how people have these experiences. Like when you're willing to actually like reach out and talk to somebody and understand them as a person, like it demolishes bigotry.
When I talk to or I'm around a non-binary person, it doesn't really, click, it doesn't connect because it is so different.
But there's still some experiences that you would have in common with a non-binary person. Say, for example, having a stage of your life where going into a gendered space is going to be uncomfortable regardless of which lane you pick, especially say like early on in transition. I'm sure that even very binary transsexuals can relate to that, and that's what non-binary people continue to go through.
I should be able to see some semblance of my own issue within that person, and I don't.
If you can't see any related experiences or issues with, say, parents disrespecting your gender identity, with, say, society at large ridiculing you for not upholding the expectation that you should be a certain way based off of the genitals that you were born with, then you just lack empathy. And that's not non-binary people's problem. That's just you, Blaire, not having any empathy for somebody whose experience may be even just slightly different than your own.
I have no issue with non-binary people. I just don't think that we're the same.
The same and under the trans umbrella are... like, you don't have to be exactly the same as like a binary transsexual to be under the trans umbrella with binary transsexuals. Like, we can recognize that non-binary people do have some unique experiences with being non-binary, just like how binary transsexuals have some unique experiences with being transsexual. And these can both coexist and have overlapping experiences all under the trans umbrella. That's the entire... like, I feel like the problem is they just don't understand the whole point of the trans umbrella, and they're just getting caught up on, well, there are differences between non-binary people and transsexual people, but like, the trans umbrella accounts for that. Are bigender people non-binary? It depends. Some of them consider themselves non-binary, other do not. My fiance is bigender and does not consider herself to be non-binary in any way, shape, or form. But there are also some bigender people that do consider themselves to be non-binary.
Creating violence in our name, they're gonna self-ID out of the...
Wait, she's my wife, not my fiance. Oh my gosh, I get so used to calling her my fiance. That's my wife. Yeah, my wife / husband is bigender and not non-binary. It can be a thing.
If sex is a binary and you're neither of those, then you're not trans.
First off, transgender doesn't have to just be about sex. That point doesn't make any sense at all. What? Also, just identifying outside of the gender you were assigned at birth would fall under, like, not identifying as the gender you were assigned at birth, which is what trans means. And, I mean, that's not even going into how, like, biological sex doesn't even fit into, like, a clean binary, and how non-binary people aren't making any claims about their sex, they're making claims about their gender identity, which is more so to do with how they understand themselves, not their physical characteristics. There's so much wrong with that statement.
I mean, you're
because-
appropriating a medical condition. That's what you're really doing.
How can a non-binary person be appropriating a medical condition if they're not even claiming to like medically transition? Like, here's the thing: if a non-binary person is medically transitioning, then they're not appropriating a medical condition because they literally have the medical condition. But if they're not transitioning, how are they appropriating it? They're just presenting a different way. They're just expressing a genuine identity. That's not appropriating a medical condition. That's just existing.
And when we have a community that there are so many categories, demi-girl, demi-boy, astrosexual, all this shit, but y'all can't fathom that maybe that would be a different category than what I am when we have such different, as you keep saying, and everyone keeps saying, experiences?
That's what the trans umbrella means. That there are lots of different experiences that have some overlapping characteristics that fall. That's, oh my gosh. How can you be... You are right. You are dangerously close to hitting the point, Blaire.
I just actually want to ask you a question. What is your dysphoria, though? Because gender dysphoria, or sex dysphoria, as I would rather call it, is an uncomfortability between my secondary sex characteristics, not just what I wear on a daily basis, because masculinity and femininity doesn't have anything to do with being trans.
I mean, you can look at gender dysphoria in the DSM-5, but the criteria for gender dysphoria is a combination of discomfort with physical sex characteristics and discomfort with being perceived and treated within a certain societal role with respect to gender, as in like being perceived as a boy, being treated as a boy, in addition to say like being discomfortable with having like male sex characteristics. Both of those are criterion for gender dysphoria. So you can meet the medical diagnostic criteria for gender dysphoria even if you aren't like uncomfortable with certain sex characteristics. Like it can be social gender dysphoria, not just like biological sex dysphoria.
You can have dysphoria without having to be dysphoric about your sex parts.
But what is your
You can have
dysphoria?
dysphoria
What is
about
your
anything.
dysphoria?
Straight cis women have dysphoria about their breasts all the time. They get breast augmentation.
not dysphoria.
That doesn't mean
That is this. Okay, so I feel like Blaire just doesn't know what dysphoria actually means, but dysphoria is a broad medical term to refer to mental distress associated with either like physical characteristics or with like a certain lived experience. So dysphoria could be, for example, I'm really uncomfortable with like how big my breasts are and I want a breast reduction because they're causing me some pain. I don't like how large they are. That makes me uncomfortable. That's a dysphoria. If a kid has like an abnormal body part characteristic that makes them uncomfortable, that's also a dysphoria. The reason why gender dysphoria is gender dysphoria because it's dysphoria, discomfort about your gender. That's what the words mean. So any medical procedure which makes someone feel less dysphoric is treatment for dysphoria. A breast augmentation can absolutely be dysphoria treatment. Hair transplants for cis men is absolutely dysphoria treatment in many cases. Even like along the lines of their gender, where like having a full head of hair makes them feel like more of a man. Like the treatment of dysphoria, and especially gender dysphoria, is far more common than just like sexual reassignment surgery, for example. Oh yeah, like laser hair removal for cis women. It has been far more common over the years, year by year, for cis women to seek out like laser hair removal than in the past. Like in the olden days, women used to be hairier because we used to not make as big of a deal out of it. Yet we as a society manufactured this dysphoria in women at large because we said that this is the right way to look like a woman, to be a woman, is to be completely hairless, like a baby or something. Oh yeah, labiaplasty in cis women's another really big example where like cis women get like pussy reconstruction surgeries to make their vagoobers look more appeasing. Like you wouldn't be getting that if you didn't feel dysphoric about your body, and so much of this dysphoria is created by, you know, societal standards. Yeah, societal standards rooted in so many isms and like supremacies, like white supremacy, like patriarchy, like all of these societal structures which say that like these types of bodies are better than those types of bodies have shaped our current beauty standards, which are causing people to get, you know, literally surgeries on their pussies and like shoot lasers at their face to look a certain way.
I cannot believe that I grew up as, this 5-year-old little kid experiencing just crippling gender dysphoria, like horrible thoughts, struggled so much my entire life to be sitting in this room and you're explaining to her what dysphoria is.
I have my experience.
Blaire doesn't know about dysphoria in any kind of broader sense than just transgender dysphoria. Because, like, dysphoria is a medical term used in many more contexts than just trans people. And Blaire not knowing that shows that, yeah, it makes sense that you actually would explain this to Blaire. And if you could bring it up that dysphoria is actually a common medical term used in more contexts than just trans people, then you can absolutely dunk on Blaire here.
The prompt was, is it different? And it is.
No, the prompt is it under the trans umbrella, not is it different? The problem is all the conservatives wanted to make the prompt, are non-binary people different, or are non-binary people who do not medically transition different than binary transsexuals who do medically transition? And like, yeah, duh. But the prompt was, should they be considered under the trans umbrella, under a shared coalition?
When I go out, I can't like take my beard off, girl. It's not coming off.
You don't have a beard, dude?
Simultaneously, our community is infighting with each other instead of looking outwardly at these structural systems that are actually truly affecting us with laws, politics.
Oh my gosh, so true, King. Like, that's the point of the trans umbrella, is like, we can build coalitions over our shared struggles. And there's so many ways that non-binary and binary trans people are marginalized by the medical system, by the political system. Oh my gosh, pop off, King.
Manipulating trans medical care.
Oh gosh, this prompt's interesting because it really, really means, it really, really depends on what you mean by manipulating trans medical care. I think that if I were on this panel, I would probably go on the yes side and then try to completely reframe the conversation around how doctors in general don't know a lot about trans bodies and how to provide access to, especially people who are medically transitioning, how to provide them the care they need in a way that acknowledges the biological reality of our medically transitioned bodies. And so often, trans people have to become their own doctors in looking things up, looking up how medicine's going to interact with their transsexual body, and looking up, how they need to be treated. And doctors not doing that for them is a manipulation of the healthcare, which we should receive, the manipulation of the best healthcare possible. But you see, all the conservatives are going to walk up and say that, yeah, trans healthcare is being manipulated because, like, doctors want to get money and transition children because they want to convert everybody into being trans for a quick buck. That is the thing about the Jubilee prompts, is like, if they give a really broad prompt, you can just say yes to it and completely reframe the narrative, and it can be very effective to get the conversation on a point that's a lot better to talk about. Like, I think the point about how doctors in the medical care system often ignores trans bodies, often gives us substandard care because people don't believe us when we say that they're trans, or they don't believe us when we say that we have, certain characteristic conditions. Like, a trans man going into, like, a gynecologist, they're often, like, laughed at and, like, sent away, and they're like, no, I'm a trans man, like, I actually have a pussy. Like, trans men are often, like, denied care or given substandard care or sent away from those kinds of offices. Same thing with, like, trans women seeking services for their own health.
I think there are the ones who absolutely think that they're doing this for the right reasons. I think that there are the ones who are absolutely doing it for money, like we saw at Vanderbilt. The people at Vanderbilt literally said this is a huge moneymaker.
We do live in a capitalist society where all healthcare is a really big moneymaker. That's just capitalism. If you're upset about for-profit healthcare, your problem is with capitalism, not with trans people. By the way, there's more money in the hair transplant industry than there is in transition healthcare. Like, you can look this up. The market cap for hair transplants is more than double the market cap for trans healthcare.
What we're seeing, not just in the trans community, we're seeing in society, SSRIs being pushed on patients. Mental health doctors are pushing so many different drugs without getting to the root issues.
I don't like that kind of narrative that she's painting, because, like, there are absolutely plenty of teens who genuinely benefit from antidepressants. But you can absolutely talk about, like, overprescription and misdiagnosis as, like, a broader conversation. But, like, trying to weaponize this against trans people is just really disingenuous, especially when we know that the regret rates of trans healthcare are amongst the lowest in all of healthcare.
Been on testosterone since I was 15 years old. And even looking into it, I waltzed my little ass up into that doctor's office and I left on testosterone. He gave me my first shot in the doctor's office that day.
Under the standards of medical care, that would not have been allowed. I don't know if he's telling the truth or if this was a doctor operating outside of the standards of medical care, but that's not within the standards of medical care.
I think like it's not, I don't think it's like a huge widespread issue, but I think when we have like a for-profit healthcare system, it does happen. Like I feel like there are I believe that people should be evaluated and go through tests. And like for me, getting on testosterone and getting surgery was a massive process in my life.
I mean, if you want to talk about for-profit healthcare, manipulating healthcare in general, you can look at the circumcision industry as another like really big example of this, where the fact that circumcisions make hospitals a lot of money means that doctors are pretty happy to ignore all the research which shows the dangers and harms of circumcision. Like, for-profit healthcare doesn't make our healthcare any better, only makes it worse, but this is not in any way exclusive to trans healthcare.
I do think it's a massive issue. I think that society in general, as Sarah mentioned, is over-medicalized right now. We're in this weird climate where there are entire political movements behind if you do or you don't have a vaccine. You can't enter this building if you do, you can if you do, you know, it's like crazy.
Does Blaire White think that bringing up the anti-vax point is like a win here? That's an entirely different issue. It's more of a public safety concern where like if somebody can spread deadly disease, like, yeah, it's a safety concern to have them in certain buildings, for sure.
There were really almost no detransitioners as recent as like 5-6 years ago.
The rates of detransition have remained basically the same throughout the history of trans healthcare, and that's to say exceptionally small. Like, there's not been a recent like explosion of detransitioners. The rates have remained exceptionally rare the entire time. It's just like if you've been doing transition healthcare for long enough, you know, you're gonna have a couple of anecdotes, a couple of examples, like the less than 1% of people that do detransition. Yeah, some are gonna exist. That's also true beforehand. The most often cited like statistic about like detransitioners exploding that I see conservatives use is they talk about the r/dtrans subreddit has had like a lot more members. But there was like a survey of the members of the detrans subreddit, and it was overwhelmingly conservatives who are cisgender, never transition, never detransition, that frequent that subreddit. So, like, there's no data to support this.
I can reflect what you said. I was over 18 when I started my hormones, but I had a 20-minute appointment, and just like you, I walked in and out with an estrogen prescription.
You were an adult. That's how informed consent care works for adults. Do you think that adults should be able to walk into a clinic and then like get medicine for certain things? Because that's the informed consent model, and if it's an adult, what's the issue? This is really going to depend on like the region that you're in, but some states in the US are able to get informed consent HRT, where essentially you would just talk to a doctor. I know that Planned Parenthood does provide informed consent HRT in some states, and you just tell them, I'm trans, I've looked at all the risk benefits of estrogen or testosterone, I want to receive it. They'll give you like an information pack with all the information. They'll go over it with you, and they'll be like, yep, you can have a prescription. If you want a continuous prescription, just come back every like 3 months. We'll do blood work. We'll monitor your safety. And they encourage you to seek out gender therapy if you feel it would benefit you. And this is how it works in some states, for adults only. Like there aren't states where you can get informed consent HRT as a minor. This is only for adults. And the outcomes of informed consent HRT for adults are very good. And once again, detransition is exceptionally rare in informed consent HRT for adults. And most of those detransitioners either were just temporarily detransitioning, they wanted to go back on the hormones as soon as they had the money, or they tried it for a couple months and they're like, this is not for me, go off of it, don't come back to the clinic, no problem.
For my initial appointment, I literally helped my doctor find gender dysphoria on his chart and mark it for me.
Hey, that's kind of like the point that I was going to make about like how doctors' lack of knowledge of trans healthcare and trans bodies is a manipulation of the quality medical care which we deserve.
If you are an adult and you walk into a doctor's office and want estrogen and you walk out, I don't think that's an issue. What is an issue is when doctors are not giving all the information, when they're actually telling you that this is what's right for you, and then it's not. They're actually manipulating.
That's not what informed consent clinics do. Informed consent clinics do not tell you this is right for you. They tell you these are the risks and benefits. It's up to you to decide if it's right for you. And if you want to continue this, we will continue to monitor your physical health and you can come back to the clinic. Like, informed consent clinics don't tell you this is what's right for you, this is going to fix you, this is going to, like, they don't do that. The entire point of informed consent clinic is they tell you the risks and benefits and let you make the decision for yourself.
I was, 20, so it's like, even 20-year-olds can have oversights. No one told me I had to freeze my sperm.
If Blaire got her HRT through informed consent, which is what she claims she did, I guarantee you the information packet she received is going to say that it's going to make you infertile. You know what? Let me see if I can find my informed consent packet that I got from Planned Parenthood years ago when I first started informed consent HRT. Let me see if I can find that. And we can see decreased sperm production is one of the effects that they list. You may be unable to cause a pregnancy, literally listing it right there. Like, they are required to give you that information by law to do informed consent. It's on the sheet multiple times, as we saw. So yeah, good question in chat. There is still a chance that you might be able to get someone pregnant. The general advice that doctors will tell you is if you're a trans person on HRT is, in terms of risks, you should assume that you are both going to be infertile for life and capable of getting people pregnant, just so that you don't make any mistakes that are going to be really bad. So, like, that's why they say, assume the worst, that you should freeze sperm if you ever want the chance of having a child again, in case of the worst case scenario where, you want to have sperm, you want to produce a child, but you can no longer do that. And they also say there's a chance you might have some swimmers that can still live, and you might accidentally knock your partner up. So yeah, it's Schrodinger's sperm count. And that's really the best thing you can do as far as, like, mitigating risks, and that's what they recommend. But it's going to depend on the person. Most of the times, you will not be able to get someone pregnant if you've been on HRT for a significant number of years. But we also do have studies which have showed that trans people, like trans women, if they go off of their hormones and they seek fertility treatment, they're, in every case that was in this small-scale study, they were able to restore the fertility of the trans person, especially if they were using, like, semen extraction techniques for, like, in vitro fertilization, where in every single case, in helping trans women with fertility treatments going off of hormones for a couple months to, like, a year, they were able to restore fertility in every single case they saw. If you want people to be provided safe access to hormones, then an informed consent model for adults is the best way that you can do that, because otherwise you're going to have adults, especially those that, like, can't go through rigorous screening processes involving lots of doctors, those that lack health insurance, like, they're going to be cooking bathtub estrogen if that's the only thing they can do, and that's just worse for the health of everyone. Like, providing this informed consent HRT, providing medicine to people, just helps the public health by far, and causes people to seek less, like, dark web or, like, bathtub cooked chemicals. Like, these are things that we can prevent by just providing people with medical care.
We just don't know, because the studies aren't there, like you said, right? So the problem is when you talk about, like, the detransition rate, what generally happens is there's no follow-up. The longest study that's been done is 5 years out. The average detransition happens between 4 and 10 years.
If there's no data, how can you... I'm sorry, if she's saying that the longest follow-up study is 5 years, which, by the way, isn't true. I've got studies on my own research document which do follow-ups as long as, like, 50 years, covering surgery results and surgery satisfaction. So it's not true that the things have only followed up to 5 years, but if studies have only ever followed up to 5 years, then how could we know that detransitions are most common to occur, like, 10 years after?
What is straight?
And that's also not even true.
I don't think that doctors are manipulating trans care. I think they're still learning about trans care. And to your point, there is not a lot of research because the research is still new and fresh.
There is a lot of research, by the way, and all of the research that we're doing is showing that we are heading in the right direction and that we're only going to continue getting better as we refine and understand more. There are plenty of medical procedures that we routinely do, that we routinely treat, that have way less research and evidence-based backing than gender-affirming care, especially with respect to, like, pediatric medicine and people that are assigned female at birth. There are so many areas that we have way less research on, but people don't fearmonger about them because they're not trans people.
For a community that is 1% or less of the general population, we can never seem to find it within ourselves to find empathy for it, even if it is the 1% of our community, which is detransitioners, and for the horrific medical malpractice, abuse, mental and spiritual turmoil they go through.
I think that we do. It's just what that would mean is affirming detransitioners in their gender identity, treating them with respect, giving them access to medical care in seeking out detransition, and understanding like the gender dysphoria that detransition experience with having body parts medically transitioned to, a sex not aligned with their identity. Like, trans people do empathize with that experience. It's just that, like, a detransitioner, at worst, goes through what a trans person who's not affirmed goes through. We should help all of these people. And the world in which trans people, in which gender nonconforming people, in which non-binary people, in which intersex people are accepted and allowed to exist as they are, is also going to be the world that's as friendly for detransitioners as is possible. If we were to loosen up about gender norms, if we were to loosen up about, wanting people's bodies to conform to a sex binary that doesn't exist in objective reality, like, that world's going to be more friendly to detransitioners who often have atypical sex characteristics because of their experience with medical transition, who often, present themselves kind of in a gender nonconforming fashion. Like, this just helps us all. As trans healthcare gets better, detrans healthcare is also going to get better, because as we get better at modifying sex characteristics, we're going to get better at reversing that too.
I think I had the common ground though, because everybody here kind of also admitted that we don't have the research. And so when we don't have the research...
We do have the research. If you compare the body of research we have on trans healthcare to literally any other field of, especially pediatric medicine, we have plenty of research. It's all pointing in the positive direction, and we're only going to get better over time.
Until we have the research. We do the research. And this is actually what GenSpec pushes as well. GenSpec organization, they push to get more research on it. So we...
Oh my gosh. Playing defense for GenSpec is insane. Did you know just the other week, GenSpec made an entire post on x.com literally just bullying a trans child for speaking out at a school board meeting because their school board was passing policies that would have prevented them from being able to go to a bathroom. This trans kid just spoke out about their own experience, and GenSpec made an entire post just bullying the kid. That's not somebody that is trying to promote genuine science, research, and understanding. All of their advocacy is just about attacking trans people and claiming that whatever research is done is not enough.
Even the WPATH guidance, the latest guidance from WPATH, everything that it says even about puberty blockers, it cites a study, and then it says we don't know.
It doesn't say that we don't know. It says that we're going to continue research and continue uncovering longer term outcomes and larger samples and more data. It doesn't say that.
In every state that's passed bans on access for minors also has provisions, except for in the most extreme cases, to conduct studies on.
They do not always have provisions for studies. That is not true. What they do often have provisions for is allowing intersex babies to have their genitals mutilated, because conservatives love altering your sex characteristics when it's to make you conform to a binary, as long as that binary is aligned with whatever your genitals looked like or were closest to looking like at birth.
Gender affirming transition is suicide prevention.
Yes, you can read literally any study on trans-related healthcare and its effect on mental health and suicidality, and you will find that gender-affirming care is actually more effective than antidepressants at treating suicidality in trans people. Gender-affirming care is phenomenal in the mental health benefits for trans people. The other thing that you'll find in the medical literature is that even stronger than being able to access hormones, being able to access doctors in terms of suicide prevention for trans people, actually the biggest factor is having a family member that supports and affirms a trans person's identity is the biggest factor in trans people's mental health. And then medical transition's a pretty important second factor. But yeah, it's a combination of being able to access medical care, having that social support, having people in your life that care about you. And in the case of trans people, the reason why you see the elevated trans suicide rate, it's overwhelmingly trans people that don't have supporting families, that are kicked out of the home, that are literally children put onto the streets. Actually, the numbers are that it's 40% of the youth homeless population nowadays are queer people. Queer people do not make up 40% of the youth population, but they do make up 40% of the youth homeless population because of how much more likely we are to be kicked out of the home just for being queer. Wait, did none of the conservatives step forward? They don't think that being able to transition is gonna keep people from committing suicide? That's crazy.
How y'all doing?
I think too often we hear, that if we don't affirm our child's, gender identity that's different than their sex, then they're going to commit suicide. We hear this all the time, especially from the detransition community whose parents were told this and it was manipulative. We hear politicians say this all the time when they're trying to, stop bills or pass bills. The problem with that is that's the same line that abusers use.
That's not. So this is completely disanalogous because it's not the case that trans kids are going up to doctors and saying, "Hey, give me testosterone or I'm going to kill myself." That's not happening. What is happening is trans youth who are not able to get any care, who are not in supportive families, who are denied any kind of resources or social support, just end up in a situation where they don't want to live anymore. And that's completely different than an abuser saying, "Do this or I'm going to kill myself."
Transition, we're all here, we know, transition is not an easy process. It takes a heavy mental toll. And so I really think that if you're already suicidal, you have to get that in check. You have to be in a healthy place before you can even think about going through the medicalization of transition.
But what if, hear me out, what if the root cause of your suicidality is gender dysphoria? Hear me out, what if gender dysphoria treatment, what if medical transition is actually treatment for the suicidality, treatment for the depression? And if you look at the studies, gender transition for trans people is more effective than antidepressants, more effective than talk therapy at treating suicidality.
When it comes to it being life-saving, the reason I didn't step forward, even as somebody who might agree with that prompt, is because correlation is not causation.
We also have longitudinal studies which literally followed trans people year after year as they were on hormones and showed that the suicidality got better. Longitudinal studies are much better at proving actually causation rather than just correlation, as long as you can isolate the factors. And the broad collection of studies we have on this, it seems pretty convincing that yes, gender affirming care does indeed decrease suicidality. In my own personal experience, I can certainly confirm that I would be much more suicidal if I was not able to transition than as I am right now. I can remember as a teenager, having those thoughts, not to a point where it was something I would really consider, but having those thoughts pop up, when nowadays that's just not the case. There's definitely a huge difference in my mental health ever since being able to transition.
Interestingly, almost all of those statistics come out of LGBT activist organizations who have an incentive to put those numbers out.
Most of the statistics we're talking about come out of peer-reviewed medical studies on academic journals, on the National Library of Medicine. There are some studies done by LGBT organizations that did LGBT surveys, but the overwhelming majority of studies on trans healthcare comes from medical research journals.
There is a vast array of options in between and around suicide and transition. Therapists and doctors aren't even legally allowed to say, "No, you're not trans, you're actually experiencing A, B, or C." And that's the case with detrans people as well.
Doctors can suggest that their symptoms might be better explained by a certain condition. And you could even do this under the affirmative model, where if somebody's I identify as this certain gender, I think I have gender dysphoria, this is what I'm experiencing, the doctor can be "Okay, cool, dude, thanks for telling me about your gender. Based on these symptoms, I think that this might be explained by this condition. We can explore this." And that can be, in addition to you being trans, it could be something instead of you being trans, it could be something that we will look into further. You can explore differential diagnoses while also affirming an identity. And that's the best way to actually help people explore their identity, to explore differential diagnoses, to explore what they're experiencing and what's right for them, is to affirm and explore. By affirming people, you're just not arguing with them. You're just not saying, "No, you're wrong. Nope, because that doesn't create an environment where people are going to open up, where people are going to talk about what they're feeling, where people are going to talk about why they feel the way they do.
Speaking of the numbers that come out of LGBT activist organizations, there was a little number that the life expectancy of a trans woman was 35. That was rescinded a couple years ago after over a decade of that being just factually, shared.
Yeah, so that's based off of like really old data that was mostly about trans prostitutes. There were some older, I think that data came from like the 70s or the 80s, maybe. Like it's ancient data about a vastly different population of trans people, where particularly trans people that are, in like physical sex work are often victimized, die of young ages. Particularly during like the AIDS epidemic, trans people were disproportionately harmed by that as well. So nowadays, trans life expectancy is about the same as cis people, and it's the slightly lower trans life expectancy on average is not due to hormonal related causes, but rather due to the lower socioeconomic status of trans people at large, as in trans people are less likely to be housed, trans people are less likely to have financial stability, and those kind of factors, particularly with like lack of access to routine medical care and like medical malpractice of trans people, lead to a slightly lower life expectancy on average. But if you're like a trans person that has good like doctors that are able to like live in a home and in kind of like a good condition, being trans, medically transitioning does not negatively impact life expectancy.
Are political too. We get caught up in calling them activists and we think it's this emotional, spiritual thing, but they are political organizations.
Yeah, so I am an activist, and so a lot of what you're talking about really was focused more on Black trans women, because Black trans women do not live past the age of 35, because oftentimes it is our group within the trans community that is often murdered, we're often harassed, we're often discriminated against, and so a lot more of that focus has had to be around Black, brown, indigenous folks, because oftentimes the research goes missing for us.
They sourced it from prostitutes though.
So they're currently talking about two different sets of data. One thing that is important to mention in the statistics about like trans people being disproportionately subject to violent crimes, hate crimes, like murder, in terms of all violent crimes, trans people as a whole face more of all violent crimes. In terms of murder in particular, it's only trans people of color that have elevated rates of murder. White trans people tend to not have elevated rates of murder, but trans people of color do tend to. And so this is where you're going to see all of these different intersecting forms of marginalization, especially along the lines of, gender, race, and class, where if you're kind of affected by all of these things, then, being, say, like a Black trans prostitute is going to put you in a lot more sketchy situations than even just being like a white trans woman.
Women have to sometimes participate in sex work to survive.
But they base it off cis prostitutes.
Wait, Blair's saying it was based off of cis prostitutes? I don't think that's true. Found this article on 19th News titled, "For years, Black trans women have been told their life expectancy is 35 years. That's false. Apparently this is because most homicide victims are victims of homicide under the age of 30. And out of like trans people that are victims of homicide, it tends to be Black trans women are the most likely homicide victims. So yeah, that might have been based off of any real data, what Blair's saying. I know if people can find data, I'd be interested in looking at it, but Blaire might actually just be completely wrong about that data existing, because it might not actually even be based on data, but just kind of a rumor.
You're in a place of privilege where you do not have to worry about the harassment and the discrimination that I face. I face as a Black person. I face as a
We're
Black
not gonna
person.
get
I'm
into
not going to
that.
say that you do not experience
Yeah, of course Blaire doesn't want to get into that.
harassment or discrimination. That's not what I'm saying, because like you said, you're a person of nuance, and so follow me here. When I come as a person of color, as a Black trans woman, you and I do not get to have that same experience. There are
You went to the White House, I didn't.
There are more rooms that you get to walk in that I will be forbidden in. And one thing about it is that's why it's important, like someone like me has to create her own space to be able to counteract what you're doing. And I'm not saying that you don't. But what I'm saying here is, what I'm trying to get you to understand is, my Blackness should not have to pay for your whiteness that
doesn't make
is
sense.
destroying my community.
I think that point could have gone on a little bit better, more so focusing on like the difference between like on the books discrimination and discrimination in practice. I see what she's saying. I don't think she quite hit it home in a way that's going to like resonate with people that are sympathetic to Blaire, which is kind of the greatest challenge of like these kinds of spaces where like you have to phrase your arguments in a way that's going to be sympathetic to people that are, coming in on kind of like Blaire's side. One of my biggest tips for doing that, particularly if you're like trying to have a conversation with a conservative audience, is don't use any buzzwords that they expect you to use. Like when you start dropping words like patriarchy, like cis heteronormative, they're going to immediately tune you out and disregard everything you're saying. You can explain these concepts, just don't use the term itself, and it goes over way better.
I enjoyed this debate for what it was. You know, it was quite ugly at certain points, and I wish that it was all trans people on the panel because that would have been more appropriate and more fitting.
Wow, you're so offensive. You're an offensive person, human being. Yeah.
Okay.
Just so
Well,
you know.
I find a lot of things over here offensive as well.
Oh wow. Yeah, you're disgusting.
And I have to. I trust.
Oh my gosh. Yeah, once again, just continuing the pattern of ugliness, but also trying to bait people into being like triggered SJWs at the end, so that that's the experience that Blaire's audience walks away with. Also, like the non-binary person that Blaire thinks is not trans, like they medically transition too. Like even under Blaire's view that you have to have like dysphoria and medically transition, like they did that. They mentioned earlier in that conversation that they were seeking medical transition. So like even under Blaire's like medical definition, they would still be trans. The liberal side did not have the strongest showing outside of Shane. 12-year-old looking guy also was pretty solid for the most part. I don't think he talked too much, but he was very good at kind of like bridging the gap in ways that show that he was definitely acting in good faith. But gee, that was painful. Yeah, Blaire White completely got away with people taking the bait so she could write them off as triggered SJWs, and that is so frustrating. It's a really hostile environment, and it's really difficult in those situations. But if you're going to be on like a Jubilee panel, especially knowing that Blaire White's there, like I think it's your responsibility to know that that's what she's going to try to do, and that you cannot fall for her trap and become the stereotype of an SJW that she wants you to look like. So, you know, like I always say, I love debate. I love these kind of engagements, but debate responsibly. People like Blaire will be incredibly irresponsible with how they debate, but they will try to trap you into making mistakes, and if you do not fall for it, you can absolutely slam dunk. Yeah, there is also just the problem of Jubilee in general tending to not have very balanced coverage from the left and the right side. Like, every single Jubilee panel you see, there's going to be, like, 1 to 2 PragerU conservatives. You've seen, like, tons of people that are, like, in, like deep in the conservative media circuit, who are, like, deep in the bought-out big money conservative campaigns, PragerU. And then, like, on the lefty side, you'll maybe get, like, a YouTuber every now and then. Like, there was the one time they had Samantha Lux. There was the one time they had Destiny. And that's about it as far as, like, big lefty people that I can think of on, like, a Jubilee panel. Meanwhile, I've seen so many PragerU people. I've seen, you know, Blaire White over here. Like, people that are apparently that one trans girl who was wearing the white top also is like connected to like anti-trans legislation. But yeah, definitely Jubilee could do better about bringing in people on the left who have solid rhetorical techniques and actually know what they're saying.